I'll be reading John chapter 14, verses 5 through 7. In your P Bible, it will be on page 1070. Thomas said to him, Lord, we do not know where you are going. How can we know the way? Jesus said to him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you had known me, you would have known my Father also. From now on, you do know him and have seen him. You may be seated.
Good morning. I'm excited to begin our journey. Oh, wrong way. To begin our journey as we talk about this word, disciple. I'm excited to look into this. I know this morning we got a few people out. We're making do with what we've got. The weather's going on, but you know what? No matter who is here, any given Sunday, God is always here. He is always here, and that is a good and wonderful thing. And so, I'm excited to begin this series as we look at this word, disciple. It's incredibly important that we understand this word, D-I-S-C-I-P-L-E, disciple. It's important for our lives. And we begin with this word from Jesus out of John 14 that Samuel read to this. Jesus said to his disciples, he said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you want to get to the Father, if you want to get to heaven, you got to go through me. That's what Jesus says. And, you know, in the Bible, there are a lot of things that the Bible does not answer for us. There's a lot of questions. There's a lot of things that the Bible doesn't give us answers for that we have to take on faith. You know, for example, things like was the earth created in 7 literal days? Was it created in a bunch of days? Was it 7 actual literal days? It doesn't say for sure, but it does say that God created the world, that He is the creator. There are things that the Bible leaves a bit open-ended, but this is not one of those things. This is not one of those things. The Bible makes it clear, it makes it absolutely clear that anyone who desires to come before God, to come to the Father, and hopefully one day to be reunited with God in heaven. Anyone who desires that must go through Christ. They must go through Jesus. It is the only way. It's the only way. In the world, there are millions and millions, countless ways that we see for people who are trying to find purpose and fulfillment in life. There are countless ways, so many ways that people talk about finding fulfillment and purpose in life, finding direction for their life. Some work better than others. Some work better than others. But the Bible tells us and makes it clear that the way to the Father, the way to God, is through Jesus. It is through Christ. That is the way. And so that is why we need to understand this word, disciple. That it's more than just a word, it is a way of life. It is a way of life for all of those who call themselves Christians. I'm sure you can surmise by the name Christian that Jesus Christ is central to who we are. He is central to who we are. He is our namesake. He is our namesake. And so to be a disciple, to be a follower of Jesus, is what we're here to understand. What does that mean? How do we do that? What does it look like to be a disciple? Well, we know one thing, that to be a follower of Jesus is what is required of us to be disciples. To be disciples. So I want to look today, at a few scriptures of Jesus as he called his first disciples. I want to look at some of these scriptures and see what it means to be a disciple. How do we enter into discipleship? How do we enter into discipleship? Because there is more to our faith, to our Christianity, than just sitting in a pew and listening, and there is more to it than that, to being a disciple. Many call themselves Christians, but not as many are true disciples of Christ. And I want us to be true disciples of Christ. I want to be a true disciple of Christ. And so we're going to look at what that means. I want us to start first in Matthew chapter 4. And this is the first example in Matthew of Jesus calling his disciples. This is Matthew 4:18 to 22. Matthew writes, "While walking by the Sea of Galilee, he," which is Jesus saw two brothers while he was walking by the Sea of Galilee. He saw Simon, who was called Peter, and he saw Andrew, his brother, and they were casting a net into the sea because they were fishermen. So Jesus is walking by and he sees these two fishermen. He notices them. And then it says, "And he said to them, 'Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men.'" In verse 20, immediately they left their nets and they followed him. Immediately they left their nets and they followed him. And going on from there, he saw two more brothers, James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother. And in the boat with Zebedee, their father was mending their nets. And he called them as well. And then it says, immediately they left their boat and their father and followed him. And this brings me to the first point of discipleship, which is being called. Being called. A disciple is one who has been called by Christ into discipleship. It starts with being called by Christ. This story from Matthew is really interesting. The thing that I find so interesting about this story is the details are very sparse, very limited. There's not a lot of details in this story. It happens really quickly. It says, Jesus saw two brothers. They were fishermen, and he said, "I'm going to make you fishers of men. Come follow me." And they follow him. He sees two more brothers with their father in the boat, and he calls them, and they leave their boat and their father, and they follow him. If Jesus had not called these individuals, they would have continued fishing. Their lives would have been the same. But when Jesus called these individuals, he changed their lives forever. And the call of Jesus to his disciples was a call out of an ordinary existence into something that was infinitely more profound than catching fish. And he called them in the midst of everyday life, in the midst of what they do every single day. They're fishermen, right? And so, of course, as he's walking by the sea, he finds two of them right there throwing nets into the water, because that's what they do. They're fishermen, it says. It's pretty obvious. That's what they were doing. And he sees the other, they're in the boat with their father working on the nets. That's what they do. And it's in the middle of this everyday life, this ordinary existence, that Jesus sees them and he calls them to something greater. He calls them to something greater. And I think it's the same with us. When we talk about being called, it's an interesting thing to consider. I've had people ask me a number of times in my life as I was going through college and stuff, and they would ask me, how do you know, or how did you know that you were being called to go into ministry? And there's a lot of different ways to answer that. I mean, truthfully, anyone who considers himself a Christian, who considers himself a disciple, is called into ministry, okay? We don't all work day in, day out in a church building or for a church directly, but we're all of Christ's disciples are called into ministry, okay? That's the way it is. But aside from that, for me, I never had a great vision or some incredible individual moment where I heard God's voice or anything like that. And I'm sure there are people who have experienced something more along those lines. But for most people, the call to be a disciple of Christ, it comes in the middle of our everyday lives. It comes in the middle of our everyday lives. It's something that grew inside of me over time. It's something that I heard through my brothers and sisters who were around me, who affirmed in me the gifts that God had given me. And I hope that may be an experience that you have shared, being around brothers and sisters that build each other up and encourage each other, that we affirm the gifts that we have, that God has given to us. But all disciples have been called by Christ to a life of ministry, called out of an ordinary, everyday life into something so much more profound. And I think the other thing that strikes me about this is the response of these fishermen. Jesus calls them. They've never seen this guy before, mind you, okay? He's walking along the river. It's a random guy. They've never seen him. They don't know him. He says, "Come follow me. I'm going to make you fishers of men." It says immediately they heard that call and they left and they followed him, which is amazing. It's amazing. And as we continue, I want to talk about that more, their response, their immediate response. But he's calling ordinary people. And I think he called fishermen purposefully, because when you work around fish every day, I think the smell of fish probably gets old really fast. Throwing nets in the water every day probably gets old really fast. Mending nets day after day probably gets old really fast. And maybe Jesus knew that. And he knew these fishermen, they want something more out of life. They need something more out of life. And those are the people that I'm looking for, the people who need something more out of life. And so they jumped at the chance to go and do something, to go and follow Christ. They jumped at it because he was calling them out of their ordinary everyday life to do something more important. And we are called in the same way. The things that we do every day, our ordinary existence, they are good. It is good for us to work, to provide for our families, to contribute to society. All of that is good for us to do. God made us to do those things. But to be a disciple means that we have been called to something even greater than that. We've been called to something even greater than that. I want to take a look now at Matthew 9. This is a few chapters later. And here we're going to see Jesus is going to call another individual. another individual. In Matthew 9, starting in verse 9, it says, "As Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth. And he said to him, 'Follow me.' And he rose and followed him." He rose and followed him. So again, he sees this man sitting in the tax booth, and he tells him, "Come and follow me." And he rose and he followed him. He followed him. And then it says this. This is the interesting part. "And as Jesus reclined at the table in the house, there were many tax collectors and sinners who came and were reclining with Jesus and his disciples." So Jesus was having dinner, enjoying a meal with tax collectors and sinners. And it's interesting, you see this phrase in the Bible, tax collectors and sinners, more than once. You see it in a couple places in the Bible, and that's because tax collectors were a special type of sinner in the ancient world. Tax collectors were some of the worst of the worst. In the eyes of the Jewish people, they were the lowest of the low, because to be a tax collector means that you have given up your Jewish identity and your heritage. You have given all of that up to work for the Roman government, essentially. So a tax collector was a traitor to everything about the Jewish nation. Tax collectors and sinners, and these are the people that Jesus was reclining with. These are the people that Jesus was calling to come and follow him, to come and eat with him. And as we talk about being called, being a disciple, I think it's just natural that we ask that question, who is it that Jesus is calling? Who is it that Jesus is calling to be his disciple? How do I know that Jesus is calling me to be his disciple? And that's the same question that we see here in this story. Let's look at this next verse, verse 11. When the Pharisees saw this, so the Pharisees saw what was happening, and they speak to Jesus' disciples, and they ask the disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" Why? They don't understand it. They don't get it. Verse 12. But when he heard it, he said, again, this he is Jesus. So the Pharisees asked the disciples off to the side, why is your teacher surrounding himself with these sorts of people? That doesn't make sense to us. Why would he do that? Why would you follow a guy like that? But Jesus heard what they were asking, what they were saying, what they were implying. And he answers them. He says, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick." And then he says, "Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice, for I came not to call the righteous, but sinners." I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. And that's the answer to that question. Who is it that Jesus is calling to be his disciples? He's calling sinners. He's calling the people who are lost. He's calling the people who need him. People like the fishermen who spend every day around cold, dead fish. He's calling people like the tax collectors who spend every day being berated by people that they used to know, people that used to be their friends and their family. Those are the people that he is calling. Jesus is calling the people who need him in their life, who need him in their life. And the truth is this: not everyone is going to hear the call of Jesus in their life. Not everyone is going to hear the call of Jesus in their life. And that's because Satan is good at what he does. God desires to have a relationship with all of his creation, with all of his children. He desires that, but not all of his children Not everyone on this earth is going to hear the call of Christ to come and follow him. And that's because Satan is good at what he does. Let me explain a little bit. We live in the United States, right? A world power, a superpower. People are always, they want to come to the United States from all over the world because we are a land of plenty, for the most part. Now, if we're being honest, we know there are people in this nation that is a superpower, that is powerful, that has more than it knows what to do with. There are people who are in need. There are people who are hungry and thirsty and homeless. And those are the kind of people that Jesus is calling to come towards him. But there are also people in this country who are powerful, like the Pharisees. People who are wealthy beyond their wildest dreams. People who have more money than they know what to do with. And I mean, I'm not saying that we should judge people like that. You know, God blesses those who serve him. And some people have been blessed because of the ways that they serve God. But sometimes Satan uses things like wealth to distract people, to blind them, to deafen them from what Christ is calling all of us towards. Satan will use things like comfort. He will use things like money and food so that people feel like they don't need Jesus in their life. And it's true. It's the reality of the world we live in, especially here in the United States. There are people who have everything that they need. And it's not a bad thing to have everything that you need. But we know, and we'll talk about this later, we know that the call to discipleship is not an easy one. It's not a call to a life of luxury. It's not. It's a call to a life of servitude. And some people just are not willing, for one reason or another, to accept that lifestyle. They're not. It's a sad thing. But if you ever wonder, is Jesus calling me? Is he calling me? Then the question we have to ask ourselves is, do we need Jesus in our life? Or is it just something to help us feel better about who we are and about what we're doing? Because if Jesus is just something that makes you feel better about yourself and that's it, then that is not discipleship. Discipleship is someone who is pursuing Christ because they need what he is offering. And if you're here, I believe you're here because you understand that you need the things that only Christ can give us. Because the richest man in the world can have all of that money, but there is not a trailer hitch on a hearse. Have you ever heard that before? There's no trailer hitch on a hearse. Because when we die, we can't take any of that stuff with us. We don't take anything with us when we die. And so it doesn't matter how much stuff we really have. We need the things that only Christ, only God can offer. And that's why Jesus is calling sinners. He's calling people who are in need, who need him, because they understand that. And they also understand what it means to be a servant, to be humble. And so this is who Christ is calling. So a disciple is called, and a disciple is called because of their need for Jesus, because of their need for salvation, their need for God in their life. But as we finish tonight, I want to go back to this verse out of John 14, because the next question that my mind went to, okay? So I'm being called by Christ. I'm being called because I have realized that I need Jesus. I need his sacrifice. I need his love in my life. But then the question becomes this: where is he taking me? Where is Jesus taking his disciples? Where is he taking us? What is the goal? Where are we going? I get that I'm called, that I need what he is offering, but where is he taking us? And this is where John 14 comes in. Jesus says to his disciples, he says, let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. Some texts say, you have believed in God, believe also in me. The reason he's consoling his disciples here is because he has just told them that he's going to die. He has just told them the plan that God is putting into action, that he is going to go and die on the cross for the sins of the world. And they're troubled by that, by the thought that Jesus is going to die. And so he says, don't be troubled. You believe in God, so believe in me too. He says this, in my Father's house are many rooms. If it wasn't so, would I have told you that I'm going to go and prepare a place for you? He says, and if I go prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. Where I am, you may be also. And then he says this, verse 4, and you know the way to where I am going. You know the way to where I am going. And that's where Thomas says, Lord, we don't know where you're going. How can we know the way? That's the question. We don't know where you're going. Where are you taking us? We don't know. How can we know how to get there? If we don't know where you're going, we don't know the way. And that's when Jesus said to Thomas, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you had known me, you would have known my Father also. From now on, you do know him and have seen him. And have seen him. And this is the final point today, is that Jesus is taking us to his Father's house. He is taking us to go and be with God, to have relationship with God, with the creator of the universe. You know, that same guy who created the world in 7 days, that same guy who held the sun in place for hours, the same guy who split the oceans for his people, that guy, that's the guy that Jesus is taking us to go and be with. He's taking us to salvation. He's taking us to heaven. That's where he is taking us. He's taking us to be saved. And Jesus tells us, those who humble themselves will be exalted. He says, those who call themselves my disciples will be saved. If you know me, then you know my Father. He tells us, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one is getting into heaven unless they have come through me. Unless they have come through me. Jesus, he called fishermen and tax collectors because they probably didn't like their jobs in the first place. They realized that there was something missing in their life, that there was more to life than just collecting taxes. There is more to life than just catching fish. There's more to life than X, Y, or Z. I think that every human on the planet knows that there is something more to life. Unfortunately, I think that most of them don't know what that is. But Jesus has called his disciples to help them understand what that is for our lives. But these disciples, they understood the opportunity that was before them. They understood it. And it's the same opportunity that is offered to us. We have that same opportunity to do something more with our lives. And you can sit here week after week and consider the pros and the cons of committing your life to Christ. And I am a very logical person, and I can understand weighing pros and cons. It's good to think things through, especially major life decisions. But as soon as you realize what it is that Jesus is offering, what it is, the place that he is going to take his disciples, as soon as we realize that, then the choice is clear. The choice is clear. And it was clear to those who he called on that day to say yes and to be baptized for the eternal salvation of your soul. That is what Jesus is offering to his disciples. Those who are willing to follow him, who are willing to be baptized and to say before the entire world that I believe in Christ, I believe in what he did on this earth, and I am willing to give my life to him and to serve him and to be baptized. And so I want to say to you today, you have the same opportunity that he was giving to his disciples then. You have an opportunity now as we stand together and sing to come forward and acknowledge Christ. So let's sing together.